shrouded in fog and quiet anxiety. The Great Depression had left its mark there. Wages had fallen, spirits were low, and in the narrow streets of the Atlas district, the air had smells of coal smoke and wet stone. Among these rows of small rented apartments lived a woman named Lilly Lindeström, 32 years old, reserved, polite, and to most who had passed her by, entirely unremarkable. But within weeks, her name would appear in every Swedish newspaper, and her death would become one of the most unsettling mysteries in the nation's history. Lily lived alone in a small one-room apartment at Brunnsgatan 9, in the heart of the Atlas area, a working-class neighborhood that often went unnoticed by the rest of Stockholm. She made her living partly as a waitress, and, like many women struggling through those years, by meeting clients privately. Her friends described her as soft-spoken, courteous, and careful with whom she trusted. Her closest friend in the building was Lilly Lindeström, no relation, who lived just a few doors away. The two women often shared coffee, meals, and long evening talks about their work and the men who came to visit. Despite the hardships of the Depression, Lily seemed to maintain a quiet sense of order. Her room always tidy, her accounts neatly written in a small address book. On Wednesday, May 4th, 1932, around 7:30 in the evening, Lily visited Mally for a brief chat. They discussed their day and the clients they had met. Mally recalled later that Lily mentioned she was expecting a man to call on her that night, someone she seemed to know and trust. It was a casual conversation, nothing unusual. Lily smiled, said good night, and returned to her own room. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Days passed. Her neighbors began to notice her absence. No sound of Mohan behind the door, no lights at night, no footsteps on the stairs. By May 10th, nearly a week later, a faint, sickly odor began to seep into the hallway. The building's residents feared the worst. Two of them finally went to the local police station to report. Officers arrived that afternoon and forced open a door. Inside, the air was stale and heavy. Curtains were drawn. The faint light of late afternoon barely touched the walls. Lily was found lying face down on the bed, completely nude, with a thin dressing gown draped loosely across her back. Her body was already beginning to decompose. At first, the officers believed it was a straightforward murder, perhaps a client turned violent. But as they surveyed the scene, the strangest began to unfold. There were no signs of struggle, no furniture overturned, no forced entry at the door or window. The room was too clean. And then came the detail that would haunt the investigators for decades. There was almost no blood anywhere. The coroner later confirmed what the police had suspected. Lily's body contained virtually no blood. She had suffered several blows to the head, likely from a blunt object, and died from the trauma. Yet, there was no pooling, no splatter, no trail. The scene was disturbingly orderly, as though her killer had taken time to clean, or something else. Near the bed, officers found a blood-stained soap ladle and a used condom. The ladle appeared to have been recently washed, but not perfectly. Small streaks of red still clung to the metal. The object was logged into evidence. The autopsy report would later note possible use of ladle in relation to the removal of bodily fluids. It was a statement clinical in tone, but horrifying in implication. The Stockholm police began questioning anyone who might have seen her in those last days: neighbors, acquaintances, clients, and a friend Mally. Among Lily's belongings, detectives found her address book, neatly listing the names and phone numbers of several men she met regularly. They contacted each one. Every person questioned claimed to have been elsewhere the night of May 4th. Every alibi was checked, no contradictions. Fingerprints from the ladle and the apartment surfaces yielded nothing conclusive. Sweden's forensic methods in the 1930s were still primitive. The police were left with a clean apartment, a dead woman, and a mystery that refused to make sense. The newspaper seized upon the case almost immediately. Within days, they were all carried stories about the Atlas murder, but the headline that captured the public's imagination came later that week: the Atlas vampire. It was a sensational term coined by the press, not the police, inspired by the reports that a body was stained of blood and that a ladle, perhaps used for drinking it, had been found nearby. In the public mind, the case became something else entirely, not just murder, but ritual, something monstrous. Stockholm, normally calm and pragmatic, was suddenly alive with whispers of the supernatural. In the sensationalism, the facts were few, but chilling. The door was locked from the inside. No valuables were taken. The blood had vanished. The column suggested a sexual encounter before death. But how had the killer escaped? And why was the blood gone? Some investigators theorized that the murderer may have collected it deliberately, possibly out of twisted fascination or belief. Others thought it was a meticulous cleanup to hide forensic evidence, though, at the time, there was no technology that would make that effort meaningful. The truth was simple and horrifying. They had no answers. For weeks, people avoided the building on Brunnsgatan. Tenants whispered that strange sounds came from an empty room: faint knocking, the creak of floorboards, the echo of a woman's footsteps. Others said that late at night, a faint light still flickered behind her curtains, though the electricity had long been disconnected. Whether those were ghost stories or the imagination of a frightened neighborhood, no one can say. But even years later, the apartment remained difficult to rent. By the end of that summer, the investigation had reached its limit. The police had interviewed every known acquaintance, reviewed all evidence, and even consulted local hospitals to check for men treated with unexplained injuries around the same time. Nothing. The case file was eventually archived under Atlas Mordad, the Atlas murder, and marked unsolved. No further leads ever surfaced. The blood-stained ladle and the other items were kept in storage for years before disappearing from the record, possibly destroyed in later decades during evidence purges. Nearly a century later, the Atlas vampire remains a fixture in the Nordic true crime discussions. Historians and journalists have revisited the story many times, and each retelling has added layers of speculation, embellishment, and myth. But when the rumors are stripped away, the facts that remain are stark. A woman was murdered in her own bed. Her killer was never found. Her body was drained of blood, and no one knows how or why. And perhaps the most chilling truth of all, there was no evidence of anyone forcing their way inside. Modern criminologists occasionally revisit the file. Some suggest the missing blood may have been exaggerated by decomposition, a natural draining process misinterpreted by early investigators. Others believe it was a deliberate act, a killer fascinated by ritual or anatomy. But with no surviving forensic samples, the case remains forever speculative. Lilly Lindeström was buried quietly, her family unable to afford a marked grave. Her story faded, then re-emerged decades later, not as a tabloid fantasy, but as a reminder of how mystery thrives when the truth is incomplete. They called it the Atlas vampire case, but there were no fangs, no monsters hiding in shadow, only a woman, alone, unseen, and a city that never found her killer. And sometimes that's what makes a story truly terrifying.